Welcome. We're thrilled that you are joining this Ashby Village Arts and Culture event, the Trumpiest time in American history before Trump, a presentation by Adam Hochschild. We're honored that Adam will be educating us today. Many of you may be familiar with Ashby Village. Some may not be. We're a vibrant and caring community of people who are transforming how we age. We support each other to age wherever we call home with self-determination, dignity, and purpose. We have over 400 members and about 300 volunteers of all ages, and a dedicated network of partners and supporters. If you haven't already, I invite you to join us as a member, a volunteer, or both, as many are. We're happy to present these kinds and this quality of programming free of charge, so it's accessible to everyone. If you're able to support our free programming, we invite you to donate to Ashby Village. We'll provide a donation link in the chat and at the end of the webinar. You can also look for a donation link in a follow-up email. I'll now turn it over to Troy Duster, who will introduce Adam. Troy is an emeritus professor of sociology at UC Berkeley, where he also served as director of the Institute for the Study of Social Change for over 2 decades. His own published works include The History of Eugenics and the bearing of 19th century drug laws on current high rates of imprisonment. All right, Troy, take it away.
Thank you, Beth. It's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Adam Hochschild, prize-winning author of 8 books, each of which addresses some vital aspect of our social and historical past. Let me set some of the context for my appreciation of Adam's work. There is something called king and battle history, in which the historian chronicles big historical events from the point of view of the victor. Many years ago, we're talking, for example, let's take Alexander the Great and what happened in that period, Holy Roman Empire and Caesar crossing the Rubicon and all the way up to Napoleon and so on. Now, this king and battle history has in recent years been challenged, most particularly by the historian Howard Zinn, who tried to upend that tradition by his People's History of the United States. Zinn was giving voice to the perspectives of those people, not that of the rulers or victors, but those who were helping and shaping the history. Now, Adam has gone one step further, in that he connects the lives and stories of ordinary people, the outcomes of grand historical events, by using a narrative style that follows individuals and shows how their mobilizations are linked to these grand outcomes. Whether, for example, the Spanish Civil War, he gives you a picture of the kind of architecture of thought of the ordinary people who went to fight in that war. And thus it comes alive. And the same is true for his work on the abolitionist movement in Great Britain, and how the English moved in that period to abolish slavery. All the way, of course, to the famous work he's done on King Leopold, the rape of the Congo. Now, Adam's contribution is distinctive because he shows how the linkages of the stories of ordinary people link to these larger social outcomes. And the example of most interesting for me was his work on World War I, where he gave really life to the idea that the architecture of thought of ordinary people who wanted to go off to war to gain glory. And you get a sense of what it was for ordinary people to be involved in that recruitment. Today, he will talk about the early part of the 20th century in the US. And you will see there some interesting connections and parallels to what's going on today. With that, I turn it over to Adam.
So thank you very much, Troy. I really appreciate that. Troy has been part of my life and the life of my wife, Arlie, for just about 60 years now. How we've managed that when both of us are considerably younger than 60, I don't know, but that has been the case. And thank you, Bab and Jessica, and welcome to everybody from Ashby Village. I'm going to be talking about my most recent book called American Midnight. I'm going to be doing it by showing you a slideshow of images. If some of the images look familiar to you, there's a reason for it, which is that Ashby Village very kindly let me try out some of the things I was thinking about when I was writing this book about 3 or 4 years ago. And there was another slideshow like this. Since then, the book has been written, and I think I've got my thoughts straightened out, and you'll have to judge. But if some of the images look familiar, that's why. Okay, let me share my screen and proceed. All right. I'd like to begin by asking you to think about some of the most dramatic and shocking events of the last couple of years. A president who tried to steal an election, the January 6, 2021 assault on the Capitol, the killing of George Floyd on camera, a string of appalling Supreme Court decisions. But imagine if 100 years from now, the standard high school history textbook said little or nothing about any of these things. That, I think, is the case today when school textbooks treat the America of 100 years ago. There were equally shocking things that happened then, more so, in fact, but we've forgotten about them at our peril. Now, think back to your high school history textbook. And if any of you didn't go to high school in the United States, this is a little lesson in American mythology. There was always a chapter on the First World War, when the nations of the old world were tearing each other apart, inflicting millions of deaths upon each other. Meanwhile, the United States was at peace, a country of small-town churchgoers, new industries, and hardworking farmers. Then those nasty Germans sent their submarines to start sinking American ships. President Woodrow Wilson declared, "Enough is enough. We need to make the world safe for democracy." He asked Congress to declare war on Germany, and Congress did so in April of 1917. American troops went to Europe. The doughboys in those broad-brimmed hats that look a little bit like forest rangers. They fought bravely, and they helped win the war. Then that chapter of the textbook ended. You turned the page, and the next chapter of American history began. The 1920s, flappers, the Charleston, Prohibition, speakeasies, and of course, the heyday of Babe Ruth. But what I want to talk about is a missing chapter between those two, because there's a lot of stuff that got left out from that high school textbook. I said that the image of the United States before it went to war in 1917 was that it was a peaceful country. But this was not so. It was a tinderbox of tensions with 3 big conflicts going on. One was between business and labor. Routinely, dozens of people were killed in labor strife each year. Just, for example, in 1913-14 alone, more than 70 people were killed, some of them women and children, in battles over a miners' strike in Colorado between striking miners on one side and private detectives and state militia on the other. A second conflict was between nativists and immigrants. You can see some of that reflected in this sign or in this sign. And a third conflict was that between white and Black Americans. Most Black Americans were doing miserable, low-paid work like picking cotton as sharecroppers, and most white people wanted to keep them in such jobs. So these were some of the tensions in this not very peaceful country of ours. When the US entered the First World War in 1917, it was like pouring gasoline on 3 sets of flames. Going to war does something crazy-making to a country. There was an absolute frenzy of hyper-patriotism. This photo shows Boy Scouts racing down Fifth Avenue in New York in a parade just 2 weeks after the United States had declared war in April of 1917. From the moment the US entered the war came a fierce propaganda barrage from the government. This is a US Army recruiting poster. And there was a particular paranoia about spies, which I think mixed in with some of the earlier ethnic hostilities. Look, for instance, at this poster. It's clearly a German helmet on that man, but is it perhaps a Jewish nose? Now, I heard something about this atmosphere from my father, who was 25 years old in 1917. He was the son of a Jewish immigrant from Germany. The family spoke German at home around the dining room table, but they were terrified of doing so on the street. Schools and colleges stopped teaching German. If you spoke German in public, you could get beaten up. Several states passed laws against speaking German in public or on the telephone. Signs appeared everywhere, like this one at a park in Chicago. There were around the country literally dozens of bonfires of German books. This particular one was outside a high school in Baraboo, Wisconsin. Robert Prager was a miner in Collinsville, Illinois, who had the bad luck to be German-born. One day, he was seized by a drunken mob, wrapped in an American flag, forced to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, and lynched. Here are the people who killed him. They were put on trial. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes, and it found them all innocent, while was anti-German hysteria in other ways. Weddings took place without Mendelssohn's Wedding March being played, for instance. Names changed. Berlin, Iowa became Lincoln. East Germantown in Indiana became Pershing. Families named Schmidt became Smith. And one change that's still with us, the Frankfurter became the hot dog. But you know, this hysteria was not just a matter of small town book burnings and lynching. There was ferocity in the air at the very highest level. Take, for instance, Elihu Root. He was a former Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Senator from New York State, now in 1917, a special emissary of President Wilson, the absolute epitome of Wall Street to Washington respectability. He told an audience in New York City in the summer of 1917 that pro-German traitors were threatening the war effort. And I quote directly, "There are men walking about the streets of this city tonight," he said, "who ought to be taken out at sunrise tomorrow and shot for treason. There are some newspapers published in this city every day, the editors of which deserve execution for treason." The daily newspapers of this era, by the way, were by and large terrible. They usually just uncritically printed whatever government officials said, like this page here from the New York Times. People like Root were as fierce as they were about the war because there was considerable resistance to it. Many Americans simply felt the US had no business joining what was essentially a European quarrel. People wrote popular anti-war songs. One strong voice against the war was a magazine called The Masses, really the liveliest magazine in America at the time. It was left-leaning, but not doctrinaire. It published John Reed, Walter Lippmann, Sherwood Anderson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, many of the best writers and artists of the day. In many ways, it was a precursor of the New Yorker with its mix of reportage, fiction, poetry, art, and it pioneered the style of cartoon that the New Yorker still uses today, with one line of dialogue as the caption. Prominent political figures spoke out against the war, like Eugene Debs, who had several times been socialist candidate for president. At one point in 1912, he won 6% of the popular vote for president. And the charismatic anarchist and feminist leader, Emma Goldman, who started organizing against the draft. 6 US senators voted against going to war. The most outspoken was Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. He asked, if this is a war to make the world safe for democracy, why not self-determination for Ireland, for Egypt, for India? These, of course, were all colonies of our ally, Great Britain. La Follette began receiving nooses in the mail. He was hanged in effigy at his alma mater, the University of Wisconsin. Other senators opened an investigation over whether he should be expelled from the Senate. Debs and Goldman had an even tougher time. We'll come back to them. The government moved quickly to suppress anti-war demonstrations. Anyone who refused military service was sent to prison or locked up in army detention camps like this one. And if they refused to do the work required of all prisoners, they were shackled to cell bars for the 8 hours a day that they were meant to be working. This drawing was made from an artist from that magazine, The Masses, who endured this punishment as a prisoner. The government crackdown on dissent had help from vigilantes. Organizations sprang up around the country. The largest was something called the American Protective League. Members got to wear badges like this that had their rank as if they were in the military: operative, lieutenant, captain, chief. And if you can read the inner ring of writing on that badge, it says auxiliary to the US Department of Justice, because the American Protective League was organized with Department of Justice support. By the end of 1917, it had more than 200,000 members. It was made up almost entirely of men who were too old to fight, but who wanted to feel that they were fighting for their country here at home. What did they do? Among other things, they carried out what they called slacker raids to find people unregistered for the draft, young men who weren't carrying a draft card. Then these guys would be rounded up, roughed up, and held in custody, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for a few days, until their family could get them the necessary paperwork. Sometimes also a slacker was somebody who didn't buy a war bond. But slacker raids by the American Protective League were the comparatively mild side of vigilantism in these years. Other expressions of it were much worse. Here's one such episode. The men referred to in this headline were Wobblies, members of the country's most militant labor union, the Industrial Workers of the World, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. One night, a group of them were beaten severely, tarred, and feathered. What this article doesn't say is that one of the leaders of those masked vigilantes who carried out this action was the local police chief. Here's what it looks like when you're tarred and feathered. The man shown in this picture was a Minnesota farmer who refused to buy war bonds. The people who attacked him were put on trial, but found innocent. Someone else, an organizer for the Wobblies, had a worse fate. He was seized from his bed in Butte, Montana, and hanged from a railroad bridge outside of town. Here's his body. His name was Frank Little. He was 38 years old. His crime was coming to organize miners in a mining town where an underground fire several weeks earlier had taken the lives of more than 160 miners. Which brings us to the point that the real target of repression during the war was not really draft evaders or alleged pro-Germans. It was organized labor. For this was an era of expanding labor unions and many strikes. Business was desperate to suppress unions. Sometimes this was done with military force, sometimes by the police. Note that these police facing strikers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, have a machine gun. The war gave the federal government and big business the perfect excuse to crack down on the left and on organized labor, because they could say, you strikers are impeding the war effort. And then something else happened that inflamed tensions still more. The Russian Revolution. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks, the most extreme faction in Russia, seized power. And the American establishment was terrified at the prospect of the Russian Revolution spreading here. The US press filled with cartoons like this one, and combined with the patriotic fervor over the First World War, this produced really the worst political repression in the United States in the last 150 years. It happened on several fronts. One was press censorship on an enormous scale. You remember that magazine I spoke of, The Masses. This 1917 issue was its last. It was printed, but it was banned from the US mail. Why? Because censors objected to several articles and cartoons. Here's one of the cartoons that offended: the Liberty Bell crumbling. And so the best magazine in the country, now unable to reach its readers because it was not allowed to travel through the US mail, was forced to cease publishing. Who was America's chief press censor? It was this guy, Albert Burleson. He was Postmaster General, and the law now gave power to him to control what went through the mail. He was a former congressman from Texas, very right-wing and arch segregationist. At the time he was born, his family owned 20 slaves. He loved being chief censor. Between 1917 and early 1921, he banned more than 400 issues of American newspapers and magazines from the mail. Some 75 different publications he shut down entirely. With his hatred of dissenting media, he would have been very much at home a century later in the Trump administration. Ironically, he managed this whole censorship operation from post office headquarters, which 100 years later became the Trump International Hotel. And during its time under that name in Washington, you could stay in the Postmaster General suite for $4,000 a night. Another front on which the government moved was to jail critics of the war. I earlier showed you a picture of socialist leader Eugene Debs. Here he is as a federal prisoner, sentenced for an anti-war speech he gave from a bandstand in a park in Kenton, Ohio. Something else the government and business was eager to suppress was the Socialist Party, and went after Debs first, and many other people in the party as well. Like many war critics, Debs was still in jail 2 years after the war ended. In November 1920, when he was convict number 9653 in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, he was again a candidate for president and received more than 900,000 votes, the first time somebody had waged a presidential campaign from a jail cell. But maybe not the last. We'll see about that. Debs was far from the only person sent to jail for speaking against the war. One of hundreds of others was Kate Richards, an orator from Kansas, hugely popular in the states of the Great Plains where she had grown up. In prison, she found herself in the very next cell to Emma Goldman, the war opponent we talked about earlier. And Goldman and O'Hare became close friends, and they each wrote about their memories of the other. And for me, writing history is all about people. And when two of the people that you're following record their impressions of each other, it's just a writer's dream. Goldman served nearly 2 years in prison, but after that, the government deployed another weapon against her. It deported her from the United States. Just before Christmas of 1919, she and 248 other radicals the government was eager to get rid of were expelled from the country on this ship, the former Army troop ship Beaufort. Now, remember, all of this was happening under Woodrow Wilson, which shows that you don't have to be a loudmouth demagogue to preside over repression. Wilson was one of the most genteel, scholarly, and dignified presidents imaginable. The author of a dozen books, a former university president, yet he oversaw one of the greatest assaults on American civil liberties we've ever seen. The year after the war ended, 1919, saw some of the worst racial violence in American history. There were nearly 400,000 returning Black war veterans and nearly 4 million returning white war veterans competing for jobs. And jobs were scarce because the war industries had closed down. No longer were there factories making tanks and guns and rifles and so on. Furthermore, Black Americans were fleeing the South, trying to get out of a region where there was often an average of 1 lynching a week. They headed north in the Great Migration, but often met more violence there. These are white people in Chicago stoning to death a Black man in the summer of 1919. Woodrow Wilson, incidentally, said almost nothing about this murderous racial violence. Here are white soldiers questioning a Black man on the street in Chicago. And lynchings took place in the North, too. The mayor of Omaha, who's mentioned in this headline, had bravely intervened to try to stop a lynching. Police managed to cut him down unconscious just in time, but the man he was trying to save was not so lucky. He died and his body was burned. Martial law was declared in Omaha and in Gary, Indiana, and other cities as well. That year, 1919, saw more than 70 Black Americans lynched, the highest total in over a decade. The total death toll of the 1919 race warfare was in the high hundreds. All but a handful of the dead were Black. There's no accurate figure for the total death toll because the largest single number of killings were in a place called Elaine, Arkansas, at the hands of both local vigilantes and sharecroppers who were trying to form a labor union. Many of the Black victims' bodies were simply tossed into the Mississippi River and vanished downstream, so we don't have an accurate count. Something else was also going on. In a way that feels eerily familiar today, the United States was swept by a frenzy about deporting people. The leading candidates for both the Republican and Democratic presidential nominations in 1920 were campaigning on promises of mass deportations. On the Republican side, it was General Leonard Wood, a blood and thunder type who was, incidentally, the commander of those troops in Omaha. Meanwhile, the frontrunner for the 1920 Democratic nomination was the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, who was determined not to be outdone as a law and order candidate. He staged the notorious Palmer raids in more than 30 cities, in which he arrested thousands of radicals or alleged radicals looking for people he hoped could be deported, and deported conspicuously in a way that would help his presidential campaign. Here are some Palmer raid victims rounded up and awaiting deportation at Ellis Island, a spot that had previously been a place of hope for the millions and millions of people, so many of them our ancestors, who entered the United States there. In the course of these Palmer raids, the raiders also seized and destroyed left-wing literature of all kinds. These are federal agents and local police in Boston. And they also trashed the offices of the progressive groups where they made their arrests. This is the New York City office of the Wobblies. They were proud of having done this and invited newspaper photographers to come in and take pictures of their handiwork, which is why we have photographs like this one. There was, however, an unexpected hero of this very dark time. Because the plans for mass deportation were foiled by a man named Lewis F. Post, who was acting Secretary of Labor. And here's why he was in a position to do something about this. The arrests of people that Palmer wanted deported were carried out by the Justice Department. But deportations had to be approved by the Immigration Bureau, which fell under the Labor Department. The Secretary of Labor was on sick leave. The person who normally would have taken his place had just resigned to run for Congress. And so the third ranking person in the department became acting Secretary of Labor. Lewis Post was a longtime progressive, and he was outraged by the planned deportations. He thought nobody should be kicked out of the United States because of his or her political opinions. He was a skilled bureaucrat, a trained lawyer, and an ardent believer in civil liberties. He found legal problems with arrest warrants, invalidated them by the thousands, and got most of the people awaiting deportation out of jail. He was able to save several thousand people from being deported. Someone enraged by Post's actions was the real architect of the Palmer raids, 24-year-old J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Justice Department's Radical Division, who had been the planner of these raids. He was enraged by Post. He prepared a dossier against him. He got the American Legion to demand Post's firing. He got Congress to investigate Post, but Post held on and kept his job. Hoover lost his battle with Post, but went on, unfortunately, to win many others over the course of half a century. He really got his start in those years, and these years, 1917 and 21, marked the time that we saw greatly enlarged government infiltration and surveillance of radical groups, something that would last for a century to come. Hoover told the country he was monitoring dangerous progressives and radicals of all kinds. For example, men like these. This is the front page of a newspaper in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, about some people arrested in an alleged bomb plot. There were 3 suspects, and supposedly the kingpin of the plot, according to the government, was the man at the upper right. Pittsburgh radicals knew him as Lewis Walsh. He was the secretary of the local Wobbly branch. He was active in the city's radical library. He was on the strike committee for a big steel strike. He was a member of other left-wing organizations as well, a friend of local socialists. And Walsh was violent. During a streetcar driver's strike, Walsh and another man jubilantly beat a strikebreaker unconscious, the beating referred to in the headline here. Somebody obviously very suspicious in the eyes of the authorities. But the whole time, he was really Agent 836 of the Bureau of Investigation, predecessor of the FBI, periodically slipping away to meet Hoover in Washington or New York and brief him. Some of what the Pittsburgh Wobblies were accused of doing was instigated by Walsh. Here he is much later in life, after he had surfaced as a National Guard intelligence officer, a lieutenant colonel. Another aspect of these years, 1917 to 21, is not only did the Justice Department greatly increase its undercover actions against progressive activists of all sorts, but so did the US military. Here's a reflection of their thinking. The military of that era thought very much in ethnic terms. Italians might be anarchists, Jews might be socialists, the Irish might be Irish Republican Army fighters, and Black Americans, of course, were an all-round threat. This is an ethnic map of New York City. It shows the upper right-hand shoulder of Manhattan Island, prepared by military intelligence in 1919. It's color-coded by where these dangerous ethnicities live. Red is for Russian Jews, brown is for Italians, dark gray is for Black people, bluish for Irish. The numbers on the map in the circles refer to dangerous meeting places, union halls, IWW offices, and other meeting places. The blue stars with the numbers are the offices of suspicious publications, such as labor union newspapers, and even the Journal of the NAACP, which was at that time edited by W.E.B. Du Bois. Military fear was so great that the Army prepared a contingency plan for putting the United States under martial law, complete with the wording of the proclamation that the president should issue to do that. Here's the beginning of that proclamation. Happily, things did not reach that point, but it's a reminder of just how close to the brink we came. Gradually, the repression eased. There were demonstrations urging the release of those in jail. These folks are in front of the White House demonstrating. In 1921, Warren Harding became president, and at last, in response to those demonstrations, he gradually let almost all the remaining political prisoners out of jail. He felt it safe to do because Woodrow Wilson's repression had accomplished its purpose. The labor movement, the Socialist Party, progressive forces of all kinds were severely crippled. And here's the appalling statistic. Just how many political prisoners there were. During this period of frenzy I've been talking about, 1917 to 21, roughly 1,000 Americans went to jail for a year or more, and a far larger number for shorter periods, solely for things they wrote or said. The most famous of them probably was Eugene Debs. Harding finally released him after 2.5 years in prison, and even invited him to stop in for a visit in Washington on his way home. Here's Debs leaving Harding's office after that visit. He joked that he'd run for president 5 times, but this was the first time he'd actually gotten to the White House. So what can we conclude about this era? 2 things, I think. First, that it's a reminder of the dark currents that have long run through this country. Racism, xenophobia, and eagerness to hunt for scapegoats, vigilante justice. And those currents still run there today. And secondly, it's a reminder of how quickly and easily such forces can be unleashed. A century ago, it was the twin crises of going to war and the shock of the Russian Revolution that brought all this toxic stuff boiling to the surface. The demagoguery of Donald Trump helped to do so again very recently. What crises may fuel these things in the future, we can't tell. But whatever they turn out to be, we must be on guard, because I think these last few years have taught us something. The same lesson as did the American experience of 100 years ago. Constitutional democracy is fragile. It can vanish easily if we're not vigilant. So it's a good time to remember the words that Emma Goldman spoke when she was put on trial in 1917. Gentlemen of the jury, she said, remember, no women on juries in those days. We respect your patriotism, but may there not be different kinds of patriotism? Our patriotism is that of the man who loves a woman with open eyes. He is enchanted by her beauty, yet he sees her faults. So we too, who know America, love her beauty, her richness, her great possibilities. Above all, do we love her great apostles who dream and work for liberty, but with the same passionate emotion We hate her cant and her corruption. It was a good definition of I'm going to stop right there, and I'd be happy to hear your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Adam. I think you already answered, obviously, quite a few questions with your talk, because we don't, so far at least, we don't have many questions. We have one comment from someone whose family was directly, obviously, affected by what you just told us. She says, my family is Pennsylvania German. They came to Pennsylvania from Germany in 1749, served in the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. My great-grandmother was attacked on the street in 1917 in Allentown, Pennsylvania, because she spoke German.
Wow, interesting. Well, your great-grandmother was not alone. This kind of thing happened to a lot of people. And then it morphed very quickly into anti-radical hysteria, which continued after the First World War ended. So,
yeah. Someone asked, where were people deported to? Did those countries have no say in the matter?
The biggest deportation that they were able to carry out before Louis F. Post, whom I told you about, managed to stop this, was that shipload of 249 radicals, which was sent to Russia. Russia was then in complete turmoil in the middle of a civil war, didn't have any say about it, but welcomed the refugees that were sent there. The ship actually couldn't go all the way to Russia, but it went, I think, to Finland, and they traveled overland to Russia. But that was the biggest single deportation. Post then pretty much put a stop to the deportations, and the right-wing forces basically responded by passing the Immigration Act of 1924, which essentially slammed the door on new immigrants coming to this country in any significant number for more than 40 years. And it was that law that kept out what might have been millions of refugees from the Holocaust seeking refuge here.
Do you think that the pandemic contributed to the repression?
That's a logical question to ask, because of course all of this was going on in the midst of the terrible influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919, and so on. I think basically the repression would have unfolded as it did without the pandemic. It's hard to trace any direct cause and effect there. But I think there's no doubt that the pandemic heightened the feeling of eeriness and tension because you weren't allowed to talk about it openly. Here was the pandemic, which had a death toll that, as a portion of the population, was at least double that of the pandemic that we've just lived through in the last couple of years. But because the worst wave of the pandemic, fall of 1918, happened while the United States was still at war, none of the warring countries on both sides, incidentally, allowed much mention of this in their press, because they didn't want the enemy to know that people were dying in huge numbers. But they were dying in huge numbers, and ordinary people could see that. They could see, dead bodies piling up outside morgues. They could see undertakers running out of coffins. They could hear desperate pleas by hospitals and so on for extra doctors, extra nurses, extra sheets, bandages, everything. But there was no open discussion of this. The only occasional mention you saw from a government official about this in the press was saying, this is a particularly bad flu season, but it'll be over soon, something like that. They made an attempt at one point to try to blame this mysterious disease on germs that the Germans had unleashed by having people from German submarines come ashore on the Gulf Coast. That didn't fly very well. But eerily, for example, the city that was most hard hit by the pandemic was Philadelphia. And there was one day in October 1918 when Philadelphia had 8 times the normal predictable death rate for the day. 8 times as many people died as would normally. I looked at the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer for the next morning, and there was absolutely no mention of this whatever. So I think that feeling of something terrible is going on around us that we are not allowed to talk about heightened the atmosphere of paranoia.
Do you see anyone who today could fill the role of Louis F. Post?
Well, I think there are a lot of good people out there who are doing what they can to stop the madness that we're facing. Whatever the faults of the United States today, I think we have much more open discussion of the issues and tensions in the country, and that the media, again, for all their faults, is much more critical of the government, and will be if the government tries to do something as repressive as happened 100 years ago. I think the media stood up fairly well to Donald Trump. Of course, he had Fox News and similar outlets in his corner. But look at the mainstream daily press today. It's much more critical and investigative than the press was 100 years ago. So that's where I take some of my hope from. I think there are lawyers who care passionately about civil liberties. We have organizations like the ACLU, which was born in this period, incidentally. I was talking about it. It originally took shape as something fighting for the rights of conscientious objectors. So I do think we have a somewhat healthier civil society today, but as January 6th, 2 years ago showed us, we still have a lot of dangerous forces.
What happened to Emma Goldman?
Excuse me, let me just get a moment. He was, as I said, deported to Russia. And she and her longtime colleague, Alexander Berkman, had great hopes for the Russian Revolution, for what they would find there. They were bitterly disappointed. They quickly discovered that the Soviet regime was just as hostile to anarchists as it was to capitalists. They were in what was then Petrograd, the capital, when a mutiny against the Soviet regime by sailors on an island Navy base in the Gulf of Finland was brutally put down. That was a turning point for many people who had previously had faith in the regime. After nearly 2 years in Russia, they left. Emma Goldman wrote a book called My Disillusionment with Russia, and she spent the rest of her life in Europe and Canada, died in Canada, was not allowed to return to the United States except under Franklin Roosevelt for a very brief lecture tour. So she was never allowed to live again in the country where she had lived in most of her life at the time that she was deported.
Any lessons from the past on how to combat the rights war on labor, immigrants, and Black folks?
Well, I think we have to be vigilant. We have to look always at the new methods of repression that are being used. It's become a war, at least where labor is concerned, that is less physically violent than it used to be. There aren't usually armed vigilantes or militiamen or private detectives out there beating up workers who go on strike, but there are smooth talking union avoidance consultants who work with companies and are suggesting all kinds of new techniques involving social media, trying to suppress union organizing. I do take heart from some of the efforts we've seen in the last couple of years to organize workers at places like Amazon, Starbucks, Trader Joe's, and so on, who were previously unorganized. But we're still at a point where the aggregate number of labor union members in this country, I believe, is still declining. So we've got a big turnaround we need to pull off.
In the same direction, is protest the best way to stop repression of press, etc.? How can we apply lessons from the past to today?
Well, I think we certainly have to protest when we see bad things happening. And I think we also have to create a kind of politics that grapples with real issues and offers people something positive and inspiring to vote for. We are all obsessed with that hardcore of Americans, how much of the electorate they make up. You hear different figures, 30%, 40%, who will vote for Trump under any conditions, whatever. And will almost certainly, unless something unpredictable happens, he will be the Republican nominee next time. But we forget that some of what's motivating them are real economic grievances. If you take the lowest 40% or so of America by income, real income for that bottom 40% has stagnated or even declined over the last 40 or 50 years. And when people feel they are economically losing ground, they look for scapegoats to blame. And Trump, Fox News, and everybody else gives them plenty of scapegoats. Woke liberals, Black people, affirmative action, you name it. I can actually end the book saying, I think one of the most important things we can do in this country is to reduce the enormous disparities of wealth we have, because as long as we have those, we're going to have a huge section of the country that will be declining in income and standing in wealth that can get passed on to the next generation, and they will continue to look for scapegoats to blame.
Do you predict similar and worse times ahead for the US, or are we peaking in 2023?
Very hard to say. I'm a little more optimistic. I do tend to be congenitally optimistic, rightly or wrongly. I don't know how next year's elections are going to turn out, but I think many of us were pleasantly somewhat surprised by how the 2022 midterms turned out. So I'm generally an optimist, but guardedly so, because we live in a world where it's not just this country that these toxic forces are surging in. All over the world, we have regimes that at some point in the past we had hope for, like Russia, like India, for instance, which are under increasingly autocratic rule. Russia, India, China, the majority of the world right now, the majority of people in the world are not living under remotely democratic governments. And unfortunately, these forces tend to reinforce each other from one country to the next. So there's still a lot of dangers out there, and I don't have all the solutions.
Someone says, I loved the book. My father, who left home at 12 in 1915, lived on his own as a teenager, riding the rails during the years of which you wrote. I learned when he was 95, he was a wobbly. I'm sorry he is not alive to discuss your book with him. How long did it take you to write the book? And do you do all of your own research for the book?
I do all of my own research. People sometimes ask me if I employ a research assistant. Never, because the research is the fun part. The writing is the hard part. I would never give away the pleasure of sifting through libraries and archives and so on to somebody else. I'd love to find a writing assistant to whom I could give, a huge stack of books with Post-its in them, half-baked ideas, things downloaded from the internet, articles and whatnot, and say, take these away and come back with a first draft and I'll take it from there. But I've never been able to find such an assistant. So I do all of my own research. I feel very blessed to live less than 15 minutes walk from one of the great libraries of the world at UC Berkeley. That's the main one I use, but when I need to find particular material in particular archives, I will go elsewhere. The reports from that undercover agent in Pittsburgh, whom I mentioned, were in the National Archives in Washington, although happily they've been digitized, so I was able to look at them online. It took me about 3 years to write this book, but I had something of a head start because my previous book, Rebel Cinderella, was the biography of a woman named Rose Pastor Stokes, who lived through this period, was indicted under the Espionage Act. So I got to know some of the actors in this period from writing that book. And so I had a bit of a head start, so to speak. Normally, a book like this might take me about 4 years.
Where did the American Expeditionary Force that intervened in the Russian Civil War fit in?
Well, this was something else that was going on during this time. Starting in the spring of 1918, Russia was swept by civil war with the new Bolshevik regime on one side, and on the other side, a disparate collection of forces known as the White Russians, which were mostly led by former Tsarist generals. And they were being supported by the United States, Britain, France, and to a smaller degree by some other countries, who were, first of all, angry that the Bolsheviks had withdrawn from the alliance against Germany. They were worried while the First World War was still on, that war supplies that they had sent to Russia while Tsarist Russia was on the Allied side would fall into German hands. Then after the First World War ended, they still took part in trying to aid the forces suppressing the Russian Revolution, because they were terrified, unrealistically so, I think, that the Russian Revolution would spread to Western Europe and the United States. There were altogether some 15,000 Americans who were part of the American forces who were aiding the White Russians, mostly not in direct combat, mostly behind the lines transporting supplies and that kind of thing. This produced some protests in the United States. Fairly quickly, the United States and its allied partners discovered that their efforts were not going to amount to anything, that the Bolsheviks were going to win the Russian Civil War, and they did. And those American soldiers came home.
Interesting question here. I wonder if you think that the fact that people more than ever get their information from often biased social media, as well as in right or left TV broadcasts, puts our democracy more at risk than at a time when we all read the same newspapers?
Well, yes and no. I think there's some tremendously destructive things about social media. Above all, the way the algorithm works that directs you to people who already agree with you. This is the way that Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and everything make their money, because all their studies show that what keeps you on the website longest, which gives them the longest chance to show you advertising, is when you find things that you agree with and that support your prejudices and so on. So I think social media is a tremendously divisive force for that reason, and an inflammatory force. And we've seen this again and again and again on so many issues in this country and in other countries as well. The days when we all read the same newspaper, I think, though, are not necessarily as rosy as they are made out to be. And I say that after having spent an enormous amount of time reading the newspapers that were published from 1917 to 1921 in this period. The press then was, the daily press was startlingly uncritical of the government. They cheered on this repression at every stage. You know, you can find an editorial in the Washington Post, for example, supporting the Palmer raid, saying this is a good thing, rounding up troublemakers and getting them out of the way. Good to do at any time, and especially right now. You can find an editorial in the New York Times supporting the continued imprisonment of Eugene Debs that said Mr. Debs is where he belongs and he should stay there in the federal prison. So the daily newspapers of 100 years ago were not the best of the daily newspapers we have today. I really do feel that in the United States today, you know, for all their faults, we are blessed to have papers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times that really are trying to cover the news in a genuinely critical way. 100 years ago, that was not true. Newspapers towed the government line. To some extent, they were afraid of censorship. I think they also simply just didn't want to rock the boat.
One unusual element of the Trump era is the cult of personality focused on one man. Was there any comparable individual in our earlier history?
In the period that I'm writing about in American Midnight, no, because Woodrow Wilson was not the kind of personal hero with charisma around him that Trump was for so many people. He was a sort of a lofty and distant figure, which some people admired, others did not, but he wasn't that kind of figure. I think you saw people who might have become that sort of figure in the 1930s, in the crisis of the Great Depression. People like Governor Huey Long of Louisiana, I think, who was very ambitious and was clearly angling to run for president before he was assassinated in 1935. Father Charles Cogwin, the Catholic priest who was a tremendous demagogue, red baiter, admirer of Hitler and Mussolini, who amassed an enormous following and certainly had demagogic qualities until finally, I think the opening of World War II did more than anything else to shut him up. So, you know, we're not immune from demagogues. I just don't think there was any Trump-like figure 100 years ago.
Our high school textbooks, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but are your high school textbooks more informative these days about these events? Does it strongly depend on where the schools are?
It does probably to some extent depend on where the schools are, because, you know, there are different high school textbooks likely to be used, especially after the laws they're now passing in Florida, say, than in California, or in Texas, where there are also all sorts of restrictions. I have not looked at high school American history textbooks in recent years. My remarks about textbooks were based on my memory of those that I used myself in high school many years ago, but I have not looked at those from recent years, so I can't really tell you about that. I would hope that people like Howard Zinn, whom Troy mentioned, have had some effect on those textbooks, but I'd have to look at them to be sure.
Was Congress as divided than as it is now?
Not in the same way. The interesting thing about this period that I wrote about in American Midnight, 1917 to 21, is that both parties had liberal and conservative wings. Among the Republicans, for example, Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, whom I showed you a picture of, was the most outspoken progressive in the U.S. Senate, and he was a Republican. The Republican political machine he ran in the state of Wisconsin was a very, very progressive one. The Democrats were divided between liberals who tended to come from northern cities and conservatives who came from the South, which was solid Democrat in those years, because Abraham Lincoln had been a Republican and had brought them the Civil War. So there were severe divisions, but they were within parties rather than between parties. And among the senators and the members of the House of Representatives who voted against going to war in 1917, there were people from both parties.
What happened to the Justice Department's auxiliaries?
That American Protective League was officially dissolved by the Justice Department a couple months after the war ended, saying the war is over, there's no need for you anymore. But the men, and it was almost entirely men who belonged to it, had so much fun wearing their badges and thinking that they were taking part in saving the country and so on, that they were very reluctant to give up doing this stuff. So its chapters in various cities around the country reorganized under different names, and I list them all at one point in the book, and simply kept going. Without draft evaders to pursue, they tended to allow themselves to be used as auxiliary strikebreakers because there was a huge wave of strikes after the war. In 1919, 1 out of every 5 American workers went on strike at some point during the year. And often the forces they faced were not just police and the National Guard, but these vigilante groups, people who belonged to the American Protective League, who reorganized under different names. A number of people from the American Protective League went into the Ku Klux Klan. And in fact, its leading figure during the 1920s had been which was the peak of Klan power, had been a member of the American Protective League.
Do you think it is possible for Trump being convicted and running for president from prison like Debs?
Well, of course, I would love to see him convicted on one of these cases, at least one of these cases being brought against him. I don't think the Constitution says anything about you can't run for president if you're in prison. It would pose a very interesting legal dilemma should he be elected while still in prison. But let's hope we don't get to that point. I'm not good at predicting what's going to happen. None of us really are.
Yeah. Could you briefly speak to the role of social media, reality television, infotainment, etc., how it diminishes critical thinking and how critical thinking can be fostered?
Well, I already talked quite a bit about social media. I certainly don't think reality television helps at all in developing our critical thinking any more than social media does. I think we shouldn't exaggerate, though, the amount of critical thinking that was happening in the past. Because, immersing myself in this very terrible time 100 years ago just reminded me of what groupthink there was then. I mean, think about some of the images I showed you, these bonfires of German books that happened dozens of places around the country. If there was anybody protesting or counter-demonstrating to that, it certainly didn't make any of the news media that I looked at. People went along with the show. An appalling number of people who should have known better went along with the repression. For example, the decade earlier, 1900 to 1910 or so, was really the greatest decade of investigative journalism in the United States, that generation of the muckrakers. People who exposed conditions in the Chicago stockyards and in hospitals, and the power of the Standard Oil Company and the way business had corrupted government. Most of those muckrakers, and I just did some research on this for a talk I just gave to a conference of journalists here, most of those muckrakers ended up enthusiastically supporting Woodrow Wilson. Ray Stannard Baker, one of the most famous of the muckrakers, became Woodrow Wilson's press secretary and wrote a laudatory 8-volume authorized biography of Wilson and acted as a consultant on a Hollywood film that was a complete whitewash of Wilson's administration during the war. So, there was not much critical thinking or critical reporting from the people I would have most hoped for it from in that era. So don't exaggerate how much critical thinking there was in the past, despite whatever problems we have right now.
There's a comment actually to a previous question saying we did not all read the same newspaper. I'm only 75, but when I was growing up, there were 5 daily newspapers in San Francisco, all with different politics.
Yeah. Well, I'm more in the depth of all of those newspapers because really every major American city had many, often many daily newspapers. There were even more than 5 newspapers in San Francisco earlier in the century. When I was growing up in New York, there were about 6 dailies, and it's a great loss to not have those papers anymore. I do mourn their absence.
Wasn't there a botched attempt to bomb the home of Mitchell Palmer, and it was organized by the Gallianisti wing of the Italian anarchists? That's
right. One of the things that added to the tension in 1919, in this very tense period, is that there were a number of bombings around the United States carried out by this tiny Italian-American anarchist group, the Gallianists. One of the places bombed was Mitchell Palmer's home. The bomber actually accidentally blew himself up on Palmer's porch. He seems to have stumbled on a porch step, killed himself, injured the house badly, but Palmer and his family escaped harm. A couple of other people were killed and injured in these bombings. And it added fuel to the fire, and it provided the excuse for the Palmer raids, because naturally, Palmer's damaged home and Georgia senator whose home had also been bombed, this was great fodder for the newspapers. They could show pictures and so on. And Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover pointed to this and said, the country is awash in terrorists and we have to go after them. Now, these were acts of terror, but they were carried out by this tiny Italian anarchist group, and none of those people were ever able to be successfully prosecuted. But for Palmer and Hoover, it didn't matter. They could use the furor whipped up by those bombings to go after Bolsheviks, socialists, wobblies, labor union members, and they did so with great fervor.
So we're coming close to the end of our Q&A. I think we have like 2 more questions here. How can one have productive conversations with those who disagree with you in thought and action?
Well, I think we all have to learn to be better listeners, for starters. And sometimes you listen to you listen to somebody describing the target of their raid, and you have to listen in a way where you're listening to more than just the literal things they're saying. You're trying to empathize with what is really the underlying discontent. The things that are the targets of the rage of people on the right now. so-called critical race theory, wokeism, trans people, all kinds of other stuff. My feeling is, for the most part, those are not really the things that are making people angry. It's other unvoiced discontents. Often, as I mentioned earlier, the fact of economic decline, which is something stressful for everybody. Sometimes you just have to listen for what's the story behind the story. Can you easily talk to people about that? It's difficult, but you certainly have to listen for it.
And the last question is a good question to end. Can you reveal your plans for a next book?
I wish I could, but I'm somewhat stuck between books right now. My problem is that writing a book takes me 3 or 4 years, working 6 or 8 hours a day. I have to really be obsessed and fascinated by a subject to do that. And 90% of the subjects that obsess and fascinate me do so because somebody's written a very good book about it. How to find my way around that dilemma is always a problem. I often get stuck. Of course, it's not healthy for young guys to be out on the street unemployed and not doing anything. So I try to keep off the streets and out of trouble by writing magazine pieces, essays, book reviews, that kind of thing. I've been doing a lot of that in the last 6 or 8 months.
Thank you so very much, Adam, for this very informative and, I mean, it's a really great talk and lots of information. And yeah, I think I give it now to Rochelle to have some final thoughts, remarks.
Thank you very much, Sigrid, for, as usual, your amazing management of all of the chat questions and comments. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rochelle Lefkowitz. I'm the co-founder and chair of our Ashby Village Arts and Culture series. Our special thanks today go to Troy Duster, the distinguished past president of the American Sociological Association, for your thoughtful introduction and context for our eloquent and engaging speaker, Adam Hochschild. Thank you, Adam, for an enlightening and in some ways encouraging window into our hidden history and into its implications for our country's future. So many of us here today have been discouraged, even overwhelmed by the state of our democracy. It's oddly comforting to see, thanks to Adam's thorough research and analysis in American Midnight, just how our country emerged from a previously fear-driven, pandemic-flattened era, how we emerged intact and even improved. To buy your copy of American Midnight, contact Pegasus, the independent bookstore, at one of its 3 East Bay locations. And please be sure, when you get the book, not to miss Adam's acknowledgement of Ashby Village. Just as it does to strengthen a democracy, if we all do our parts, it takes a village to produce a meaningful, enlightening quarterly arts and culture event like the one today. In addition to thanking our speaker, Adam Hochschild, and former American Sociology Association President Troy Duster, I want to thank the hardworking members of the Ashby Village Arts and Culture Group. Sigrid Duisberg, as I have said, for her masterful job of managing your thoughtful questions. Irene Marcos and Rondi Saslow for their tireless outreach to all of you. And to our 2 new members, Elizabeth Hutchins and Myra Kaplan, who jumped right in with new energy and new ideas. Thanks also to Ashby Village's Executive Director, Bab Freiberg, for your warm Ashby Village welcome that set just the right tone for today's presentation. And to Ashby Village staff members, Cherise Hanshaw and Jessica Sterling, for your considerable communications and tech support. We've been committed for over 7 years now to bringing you high quality, memorable presentations like the one that you just had today, which is why, although all of our arts and culture events are free, we hope that if you were as wowed by today's event as I was, you will consider making a donation to help us continue to offer top quality events like this one. So thanks for joining us on this glorious spring afternoon. And before I pass my baton on to our Ashby Village staff member, Jessica Sterling, I want to remind you to please watch for the June issue of Village Voices, our monthly Ashby Village newsletter, for news of our next arts and culture event. And when you see it, RSVP early and bring a good friend with you the next time you come.